Well, thank you very much for attending this session, this panel, Keeping Commitment for a Sustainable Future, where we will discuss the road to 2030 and the implementation of the SDGs. It's our pleasure to welcome back Monique Berly, who has organized this panel. Monique was the Executive Director of the Global Governance Center at the Institute until last year. She joined our neighbor at the University of Geneva, joined the faculty there this September. And it's not a coincidence if the panel is organized by the Global Governance Center, because there has been a long tradition of research that could feed policy regarding the SDGs through the Global Governance Center, with first Tom Bierstecker and others. And without further ado, I will let Monique introduce the speakers and the themes of the conference. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. So is it too late for the Sustainable Development Goals? Are they in peril? What kind of concrete actions are needed to get them back on track? These are some of the questions that reverberated throughout the halls and corridors of the UN headquarters in New York last week on the occasion of the 78th General Assembly and the SDG Summit. In their search for a cause worthy of eliciting transformative change, world leaders constantly evoked today's youth and future generations. When we speak of a future with sustainable development, we speak of a better world not for us, but for our grandchildren and their children, exclaimed the president of Malawi in his Unga address. But of course, to craft a future for the youth, our leaders must not only think about future generations when they make decisions today, but they must also listen to the youth, to their concerns, to their ideas, as well as their dreams. They must make space for them and involve them in governance structures. And it is to this end that this evening's event will take the form of an intergenerational hot seat style dialogue between 3 students from leading universities in Switzerland and 4 International Geneva leaders. Time permitting, we'll cover vast terrain in terms of topics, including challenges faced by governments, the role of private sector, the place of technology, and also the kind of bold policy decisions that together might transform our utopias into reality. So we have quite a lineup this evening, and I'm pleased to first introduce tonight's 3 student voices. So beginning furthest away, but with our local representative, we have Hare Hadi, who is a second-year master's student in International Relations and Development Studies here at the Graduate Institute. Before beginning her studies in Geneva, she previously worked for the Kurdistan Regional Government, where she helped liaison with the UN investigative team charged with promoting accountability for crimes committed by ISIL in Iraq. So thank you for being here, Howard. Next, we have Rosendo Manesfuara, who joins us from the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, where he's about to graduate with a master's degree in microengineering. Rosendo is also the co-founder of Resilio, a Swiss company that helps organizations reduce the environmental footprint of their IT activities. At Resilio, he notably collaborated with EU regulators to enhance the environmental transparency of the ICT sector, as well as with ICT companies to better comply with ESG regulations. Thank you for joining, Rosendo. Coming to us from the other side of the country, we have Ines Morales-Weiden, who's presently pursuing a double master's degree at the University of St. Gallen and Sciences Po in International and European Affairs. She's also the member of the Circle of Young Humanitarians, a nonprofit youth association that facilitates dialogue between youth and the humanitarian world. Welcome, Ines. So now turning to our 4 International Geneva leaders. We're pleased on the far right to have His Excellency Matthew Anthony Wilson, who serves as the permanent representative of Barbados to the United Nations Office at Geneva. Throughout his diplomatic career, Ambassador Wilson has worked on and participated in negotiations on a range of topics, including fisheries subsidies, trade for small economies, and the interconnection between work and human rights. Thank you for joining us this evening, Ambassador Wilson. Then, coming towards me, we have Aggie Veres, the Director of UN Development Programs Representative Office in Geneva. In her current role, she's notably responsible for the UNDP's external relations and advocacy, as well as UNDP's Geneva-based policy and program work. Welcome, Aggie. Next up, we have António Gambardella, who acts as the Managing Director of the Fondation Genevoise pour l'Innovation Technologique, otherwise known as FONGIT, which is a public interest foundation funded by the state of Geneva, whose mission is to foster the development of innovative tech startups in the Le Mans region. Thank you for being here, António. Last and certainly not least, we're also pleased to welcome Özge Aydoğan, the director of the SDG Lab based here in Geneva. Özge has over 13 years of experience as an international development professional, whose work has predominantly focused on forward-looking social and economic development, anticipatory analysis, innovative partnerships, and strategic foresight. Voila, so without further ado, we're going to get things started. So first on the table is the role of governments in relation to the SDGs. So I pass the floor to you, Heor.
Thank you, Dr. Burley. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight, and thanks to special thanks to our esteemed guests for accepting the invitation to be with us tonight. My first question is for His Excellency, Ambassador Wilson. Based on the most recent statistics, many of the governments with least progress or even regression in achieving the SDGs are in fact those governments that are facing internal hurdles, significant economic challenges, and difficulties in delivering the basic needs of their populations. In such instances, and taking into consideration the different dynamics of these governments, what strategies or mechanisms can be embraced to assist these governments? Thank you.
Thank you, and a real pleasure to be here. I have to say, some of these questions that our colleagues here to the right asked were tough questions, so congratulations, because actually we need people to ask tough questions and to hold people like us here a little bit more accountable. So, first, I think it's really important to remember what it is that made the SDGs so special. Governments, supported by the private sector and civil society, came together to agree on this amazing global plan to support sustainable development on land and sea and address poverty, inequalities, and improve key indicators for all livelihoods. A lot of time was spent on developing indicators, on creating these massive communication campaigns, trying to create coherence between UN agencies so they prioritize the SDGs. And then COVID came, and then climate change came, and the recession came, and the war came. And in 2023, despite all of the noise in New York last week, let me be honest, some of it is noise. No one needs to see a drone show showcasing the SDGs emblem. Despite all of that, and a call for recommitment, the fact remains that if the UN was a company and progress on the SDGs was its annual report, it would be shut down. Let's be honest. 15%, that's not a good return on investment, huh? But that is very simplistic and a very kind of back of the envelope assessment, because the reality, of course, is a lot more nuanced and a lot more complex. Because we have to imagine what a world would be like, especially today, without the SDGs. The SDGs is a form of a global lodestar that many of us can point to. Imagine if we did not have the aspirations of meeting the goals. Imagine how much worse off we would be after the pandemic. Imagine if we did not have the anchor of the SDGs to talk about climate change or gender equality. Believe me, it would be a lot worse than 15% progress. But it doesn't excuse the fact that we're off course. And frankly, I'm not convinced that all of the summits in the world and all of our future agendas of the world will accelerate our progress. What needs to happen, and you hinted at this, is that companies need to deepen the incorporation of the SDG goals, indicators, and pathways into their domestic development plans. So that they can, and not so they can go to New York every year and show their peers what they've done, but so that the value of the goals and the measurable indicators at the global level can find themselves sitting comfortably at the local level. For too many of the government action plans I've seen have been about external consumption and external rubber stamping, rather than truly integrating the goals into the local planning, the spending, and the accountability ecosystem. All governments today have internal challenges. They always have. The beauty is that many of them are shared challenges, such as climate change. But the ugliness is that resources, policy leverage, and power is so unequal and imbalanced globally that some countries, especially the most vulnerable like mine, Barbados, feel unable to make progress. And I can tell you that powerlessness can breed inertia. So we must do better at showing how addressing the SDGs is also about addressing the internal challenges. The SDGs need to go local. The SDGs need to get on that plane and traverse a drought-stricken village in Somalia. The SDGs need to swim in that heating ocean in the Caribbean where the coral reefs are bleaching and the fish are dying. The SDGs need to walk the roads of the towns where women are being forced back into virtual servitude. The SDGs need to stroll through Djibouti and see what 77% youth unemployment rates look like. The poor, the hungry, the beaten, the discriminated against are not interested in fancy drone shows or SDG pins. They want to know that the SDGs mean more financing to countries that need it, more employment opportunities through more private sector investment, that money for health and education is not going to be constantly reoriented to debt repayments. So we need the private sector, I think, to step up a lot more. I mean, I think some of them have done a good job, but there's a lot more that they can do. Branding with the SDGs is a great first step. But let's see how you can partner with local MSMEs in developing countries and include them in your value chains. Let's see how large companies can possibly put 1% of their global profits into a global SDG fund. Imagine what that could do. Let's see more focus on results and less on strategies. Let's see the global financial architecture and the banking system open the door to grants, open the door for novel ways of looking at of lending, like debt for nature swaps. I want to see more innovative programs. I want to see green technologies. I used to work at the UN and the WTO, so I'm saying this because I know it. The UN agencies need to stop navel gazing. If you receive $100 to support developing countries, plan for at least 90 of that to go to the country that you're helping, not 30 and 70 staying within your administration here in Geneva. Is it going to be easy? It's not going to be easy, but we need to know that what we've done up to now, while positive, has under-delivered, and we need to do more to make the SDGs go local. Thanks a lot for that great question.
So I'll continue also asking you a question for you, Ambassador Wilson. And my question is more also about climate change. I'm an engineer, and so I really look at facts and what's happening about climate change mitigation, the Stockholm resilience with the planetary boundaries, and all that stuff, like real data and what's happening. So my question is the following. The IMF says Barbados is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and it needs to invest heavily to protect its citizens from hurricanes, flooding, and droughts, and to preserve its natural capital. So could you elaborate a bit more on how the SDGs can help mitigate the effects of climate change in terms of science or real effects?
How many of you here have been to Barbados? Oh, come on now. Come on. It's the home of Rihanna. You have to go. Huh? Listen, the reality is 2023 was the hottest year on record. The main disruptor of food prices and food volatility in 2023 was not the war in Ukraine. It was weather. According to WMO, sea levels have risen more in the last couple of years than any time in the past 3,000 years. And this loss and damage fund that many of you hear about, that was agreed to at COP27, I think, or 28, we need $671 billion annually by 2030. So put yourself in the place of me, a citizen of a small developing country like Barbados. Beautiful beaches, lots of music, great sunshine. But if you look a little bit deeper, especially in 2023, you're going to see more droughts because of water shortages. You're going to see soil degradation, hence agriculture yields are less. You're going to see rising sea levels, which are allowing salt water to creep into the aquifers and destroying coral reefs, and hence very vital protection for the island. You're seeing heat is rising and is affecting productivity, is affecting machinery, more vicious and unpredictable storms and hurricanes, limited access to global financial assistance for climate financing, and then incredible food insecurity because of high food importation costs. So Barbados and many other small island developing states like mine, we are legitimately at the front lines of the climate crisis. So imagine if you went out with some of your friends and you had an espresso and they all ordered champagne and rum. And then when the bill comes, they expect you to contribute equally. You would resist that. Or if you were like me, you would excuse yourself, go to the bathroom and jump through the window. But whatever, you would resist that. We did not cause where we are today. Barbados, Samoa, Vanuatu did not cause where we are today. And hence we cannot be expected to contribute at the same rate of a US or EU or China. But it is the global commons, so we must contribute in some way. So one way, and this is to answer some of your questions, one way is through advocacy. So Barbados has really led the way on this initiative called the Bridgetown Initiative, which is calling for a reform of the global financial architecture to ensure that climate funds meet those vulnerable countries that need it the most. And the SDGs here have been really important because the SDGs have allowed us to anchor our advocacy and to have our calls amplified. I don't think as many people would have heard about this initiative if it wasn't for our ability to link this to the SDGs. And another way is by using the lens of the SDGs to tell our stories, to share our realities. The SDGs have done a wonderful job of putting a spotlight on stories and what people are actually going through all over the world. So healthy oceans, well, not when they're warming and coral is bleaching and fish are dying and beach erosion is happening. No poverty, not when we're losing jobs in key sectors such as agriculture, when changing weather patterns kind of vacillate between droughts and hurricanes. Gender equality, not when the group most vulnerable to climate change are women, especially rural women and indigenous communities. So mitigation, a lot of people talk about mitigation. For me, mitigation is a bit of a Band-Aid. You know, I think we're beyond that. We need to focus on adaptation, if I'm honest with you. So, you know, you asked about some of the things that we're doing. So we're building seawalls to stop the ocean from taking over our land. We're trying to upgrade our infrastructure to stop the salt water from seeping into our drinking water. We're purchasing electric buses to cut down on fossil fuel use, and the list goes on. But it really is adaptation that we need to focus on. So future-proofing our infrastructure, finding ways to use less water in agriculture, helping our small business to understand what a green transition actually means, and to help build the skills to operate in a world that is calling for less carbon-intensive products and services. So for us, you know, we see the SDGs as a bit of a platform and a watchtower, a platform to share our challenges and our wins, but also a watchtower where we can learn from others, where we can embrace scalable projects, which I think is really, really important, and scalable initiatives like turning this fabulous thing I've seen recently about turning seaweed into plastic substitutes, or investment into vertical agriculture. So we're using the SDGs in a way to get access to knowledge and expertise that we probably wouldn't be able to get access to if you didn't have that platform to be able to bring not just governments, but also the private sector and innovators around the table. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So to give the ambassador some time to breathe, we'll transition now to the topic of the SDGs in the private sector, which already came up a bit in response notably to the first question. But as Goal 17 is also about partnership, including partnership across the UN and with private sector, I'll now hand it over to Ines to get us going on that.
Thank you so much. So introducing sustainability innovations often faces resistance or skepticism from consumers and society. I also experienced this when I had the honor to implement a project at the University of St. Gallen. We're now installing over 500 panels on the roof of the sports hall of the university, and we had some challenge in finding investors for this project. So my question would go to Mr. Gambardella. My question is, how do startups and businesses at Fungit approach the challenge of gaining social acceptance for their sustainability-focused products or solutions? And could you share any strategies or examples where these innovations successfully overcame initial hurdles and gained broad public support?
Thank you very much for the question. Thank you for having me here. Fungit is a state support organization. So our job is really to foster tech entrepreneurs to thrive and to develop their companies. Today we support more than 180 projects, representing 2,000 people, companies that raised about 1 billion of private money so far. And every time we receive a new project arriving, we ask ourselves the first question, which is, are we really betting on the success of a company which has a net impact negative regarding SDG? The answer is obvious, no, we don't. And this is because companies addressing SDGs now are actually, they have a too large competitive positive advantage towards the others. And let me explain you why. But first of all, they are on a mega trend, and is going to be nothing that better in the future with times to come. But it's important to realize that this actually applies to both investors and clients. And I will get to your answer, but I need to address it a bit beforehand. So SDGs companies, they have companies addressing SDGs, they have a positive advantage when it comes to investors, believe it or not. Today, investors, even the most reluctant ones, even the ones that just do some SDG washing or greenwashing, they prefer to invest into SDG companies because they realize, or they have realized, that the market is going to premium those companies in the future. Second is about the client. But before going to the client, I need to tell you something which is very important. Being a company addressing SDG is just the beginning of the story. It's a precondition for any company. But it's not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. Because you need to have anyway a good startup that has a good product market fit, that knows what it's going to do, that does an addressable market. So a good startup that does good. This is the goal now of those companies. And now, let me get to the point of the client. So if you have a good startup that does good, you are bound to success. You are bound to that. You need to be patient. You can get capital. And then you wait. I give you two small examples about companies that we are in our portfolio. One is a company that is in the pure clean tech. It's called TVP Solar. They're doing thermal solar panels, vacuum solar panels. They can heat up water up to 200 degrees, which becomes steam. So it's for steam, industrial steam application. So when they started in 2007, they were struggling to find investors because investors, they were not even able to understand the difference between a photovoltaic and a thermal panels, back 2007. Then what happened? They waited, they found some good investors, they waited, but the market was not there. And then there is always a tipping point. In that case was the oil price. The oil crisis went up, immediately they become in the market, so now they are so successful they cannot keep up with the production. So you need to have staying power as a startup in order to be able to survive and to get to the tipping point. In the meantime, you educate, you evangelize, you try to be, as much as you can, trying to bring the message about your good startup doing good. But investors listen to that now, so they can give you money for being patient and having you getting to the market. Second example, very short, company which is more local. Maybe TVP Solar, you guys don't know it because it's really B2B. Based in Geneva, coming from CERN, so technology coming from CERN that applies this for industrial application. Another company called Magic Tomato. Maybe some of you, they know Magic Tomato. What they do? They do local delivery store. It is SDG. Why? Because it's a shorter value chain, shorter supply chain. it is really going towards the deglobalization of the world. Again, they were struggling. They were growing, but it was difficult to have the clients getting to get what was really the difference. And then what? COVID happened. There was a phenomenal accelerator, and now they started, they grow, and they acquired other companies. Now they're leaders in the whole Western Switzerland for fresh food delivery. What is the technology there? Is the infrastructure, the logistic infrastructure that is able to get to the artisan of the region, fresh product, and actually going in the mega trend of the deglobalization. Finally, I want to say, again, because it's very important, SDG is a precondition, but it's not sufficient. Necessary, but not sufficient. We look for good startups that do good. Thank you. Stop here.
Thank you very much for the answer. My question also relates to private sector and really how companies can use SDGs, like for good or also bad. And the question now is for Mrs. Adoyan. And so SDGs are, sorry if I mispronounce it, SDGs are used by plenty of organizations, including corporate firms, in annual reports to showcase their efforts on sustainability. However, they are not legally binding, to my understanding. I mean, companies can use them as they want without any consequence when wrongdoing. It's sometimes what I call greenwashing, no? And so what are your thoughts on combating greenwashing with the use of SDGs? I mean, it's something that's been said before. I mean, some companies prefer to invest in those companies in the private sector. We have those SDGs labels, but there's no data behind. They're not taxonomy aligned. They're not classified into Article 6, 8, 9 of SFDR. And so my feeling is that sometimes the showcase of all those SDGs will then hide the real opportunities and programs that countries like Barbados need, and they need that platform. And if all those major companies actually use wrongly those SDGs, then those initiatives, local initiatives, will be hidden.
Does it work like that? Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for a question. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's late, so we appreciate your time listening to our conversation here. I would also actually love to hear what you think about it, to be honest, you know. I mean, it's a good format that you're asking us questions, but I would also love the opportunity to ask you questions back. Maybe we can do that a bit later, and the same with the people here in the room beyond the panel. But yeah, I mean, listen, I do not have a very maybe complete answer, but I can give you maybe some snippets in terms of the thinking on this. Interesting enough, I just told Ines that I was also at the University of St. Gallen, so I did study in a business school. I spent a lot of time in my student life, at least, thinking about SDGs, and not SDGs per se, but ESGs for that matter, actually, how you can be environmentally, socially speaking, doing business better. Now that I'm in this position as director of the SDG Lab, I have a bit of a different take, and let me tell you what it is. I think particularly in the private space, and you know that much better, the yardstick at this point are ESGs. But that should not be necessarily the case, because the ESGs, there is no regulation really in terms of a coherent framework. I used to work at some point in a development bank. I'm not going to name you which one it is, but you can find out if you go on my LinkedIn. What I wanted to say is, you know, the framework, the consistency, the coherency is to a certain extent missing. In the MDB world, for those who have spent some time working for IFIs, you know that at least back in the days, it used to be the International Financial Corporation, IFC, that would set the standards, and then all the other banks, the World Bank, so to speak, and then all the other banks would, to a certain extent, adapt their own ESG standards. But in the private sector, that's to a certain extent missing. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is the metrics should be SDGs. It shouldn't be mitigation. It shouldn't be reducing risks, but it should really be about contributing positive impact, if that makes sense. I think that's one of the issues. I think the other issue is, if I may say, it's lack of accountability, you know? I mean, I think we live in a world where we have a lot of commitments. I do have the pin, I'm sorry, Ambassador. I felt I need to do that in terms of corporate, you know, presence, but the truth is, the pin is not enough. I give you that one, you know, and I think we see a lot of pins happening. I went to Davos earlier this year, and there were a lot of pins on many people, but it's not enough to do that. And I think we have to really think about how we're going to walk the talk in terms of accountability, because we do not have, if I may say, a sanctioning system. I don't like the word. We can maybe call it incentive system. But, you know, if you go out there and pollute the ocean, you know, if you cut trees, if you do this and that, who really is punishing you for that? And I think the issue on that, if I may say, and I come maybe more a bit to the solution side of things, is think about it. What if we would have an experiment in terms of a thought experiment and do, for example, costing? If we would cost the pollution of the ocean, if it would cost, you know, if we would assign a costing to a tree, for instance, I think things would change. And there are good examples, maybe not necessarily on the costing side yet, but on the right side, if I may say, where you're looking into enforcing rights from an environmental perspective. I mean, there are conventions, environmental conventions, where you have, you know, certain standards set and you would apply those. But I think it has to be a bit that top-down, but then also the bottom-up, and that's where I want to close, if that's okay, is I think the issue, guys, is we do not care enough, you know? We are all here because we care. I mean, you're coming and listening to us because you care, but and Aggie, actually, we're in a session this morning, she made this brilliant point about we need to speak to those we have not yet had the chance to have a conversation, which I felt was a brilliant one. It's true, you know? How can we make people care? I think incentive systems that are top-down are one part of the picture, but there has to be a bit more, I think, to that. And again, I'm leaving you with this, because if you have a solution, please call us up at the SDG Lab, because we are trying to understand how can we make people care. If you would care, we would do things differently today. So that's where I leave you.
Thank you so much for this thought-provoking answer. I'm actually continuing on this part, like who's punching the ones that are emitting, and how can we influence businesses and make them care? So yeah, international organizations often advocate for sustainability, yet there are concerns that their influence on businesses can be limited. So my question goes to Mrs. Veres. How can organizations like the UNDP exert stronger leverage to encourage businesses, especially multinational corporations, to adopt sustainable practices, even in regions with lax regulations or conflicting interests?
Thank you very much. It's a hard act to follow the distinguished speakers, but I'll try my best. So I'd like to bring in a bit of a different angle, exactly what you asked, and links a little bit to the previous speakers vis-a-vis our relationship with the private sector. Because I think, you know, you all heard the narrative that our ODA-based interventions in developing countries trying to achieve the SDGs or the grants, they are just absolutely far away, light years away from the needs. So we're talking about closing this gap by leveraging the financing that's out there, public, private financing. So that's why the role of the private sector comes in, the financial sector especially, and that's why we're talking about how to align their practices, their investments, the various financial instruments that essentially generate a positive impact on the SDGs. So, you know, that's kind of what the conversation is overall. But at the same time, it's really important to understand the motives and interests of the private sector. Because even if, you know, they are do-good startups or they are motivated by the market premium, at the end of the day, the private sector is there to do business. They are not there to replace the role of development organizations like UNDP and suddenly save the world through the SDGs. So we have to be realistic about it. And when we understand that, we have to find the ways where we find a common ground. Why would they want to work with us? You know, if you think about it, why a large private sector organization that has resources multiplied by what we can offer would want advice from UNDP? But actually they do, and that's what I want to talk about, why and how and what we can do more of. You know, the ambassador did a good, accurate picture of what the concerns and the challenges of the UN are. At the same time, I think, you know, we are in a unique position because we are not driven by markets. We are not driven by bilateral interests or any particular agendas. So the fact that, you know, we are a neutral actor and we're driven by particular targets when it comes to global development, that already is a good entry point for us to work with private sector. Now, when we look at the need and what we're trying to achieve, so UNDP and OECD estimates that shifting just 1% of total global financial assets, which is estimated about $469 trillion, could bridge the existing financing gap. So they're just 1%, as you said, can we create a 1% fund? But it's, of course, not that easy. At the same time, when we're looking at how this is going, the real challenge is to align these trillions that are invested daily in capital markets, that are invested daily, whether it's with the SDGs or not. So what we want to do is that they should be invested that benefits the SDGs. So I want to give you a few ways how we work together, where this common ground is, linked to the challenges and the barriers why it's not happening. So one, if we look at the overall policy environment and the incentive structures. I mean, first of all, we need to look at what is the regulatory environment for private sector to work in, whether it's private businesses or the financial sector specifically. So that is determined by many things, but one of the main things is the country-level policy environment. So I'm sure in Barbados you have thought about your policy and regulatory environment for investments, for aligning that capital. So we are working now in over 90 countries on the so-called integrated national financing frameworks. So what they do is that basically the governments use this as a tool to put their money where their mouth is per se. So depending on what are their SDG challenges, which goals they need to invest in, whether it's education or climate response, essentially it has to be the only way you can invest like that public and private resources if you actually have a framework that guides the money there. So this is a tool that shows the right financial policy and regulatory environment, and that sets the stage for private finances and guides those investments decisions. So that's one. I think the second big barrier that we see in terms of private sector investments is, especially when it comes to, for example, overseas investments and even startups, small enterprises, is the risk environment. So how can we help de-risking this environment that the private sector doesn't want to invest in? Because if you look at any large development bank or private banks that want to invest along the SDGs, they may have their goals that they want to do green investments or whatever they do, but at the same time, when you start talking to them, as soon as you start talking about emerging markets, you see a lot of glazing eyes, and you just, you lost them. So yes, there's a lot of investment channeled now by private sector, but a lot of it goes to the wrong places, not necessarily for the wrong things, but creates further inequalities, because the investments are not going to the least developed countries. The investments are not necessarily going to markets that have these barriers because of the risk perceived by the unknown. They just simply don't know the markets. They don't know the regulations. They don't know, for example, the security risk, for example, and so forth. So this is where we come in as a UN organization. We are present in 170 countries and territories where we work with governments, local private sector, local NGOs, the whole community and the whole ecosystem. So we can unlock this problem in many cases. So a very particular and very concrete way we're doing it. We have worked now in many countries creating the so-called SDG investor maps. So what they are essentially investment opportunities. But the way we are working on this is really working with the local ecosystem that identifies where the investments need to go from a development perspective. Because you may attract a lot of investments in climate response in a certain country, but is that the right mix of investments for that particular setting? It's good. It's always good to invest in climate, but is that the right mix of investments? So we're looking at the needs of every single country where we do these maps, and then we align them to a return on investment. We align them on the risk, so that those who are interested in these investment opportunities have a good picture that, for example, in Armenia or in Barbados, what are the needs, how do these align for investment opportunities, and how they can then be translated into pipeline. And I'm sure those of you who follow these financial and private sector conversations, you hear pipeline all the time. That's what the investors are saying. Where is the pipeline? How can we invest? So that's where we can play a role, is also to close that knowledge gap, that information gap, so that the investment opportunities and the projects that need these investments are linked to the investees who are looking for these opportunities, and simply the market is not allowing to find each other. Then another important factor, and again a barrier, and this is where we can do more together, is then how do you monitor and measure the success? How can you say this company was really contributing to a set of SDGs? Goes to the greenwashing, bluewashing idea. So we are working, and we have worked together, and this is a very complex issue on basically SDG standards and the related monitoring and impact framework that allows, some kind of comparable measurement, not just for individual investments, but then looking at a comparison. And this can be applied for individual project investments, startups, or it can be applied for financial instruments like bonds and other financing instruments that we are working on as innovative products as well. And then essentially that is what assures, and you asked this question about how do I know if it's really an SDG impact on this investment? Because we are developing these frameworks, and then you can actually make the link. You invested in this, and this is where it went. And that transparency is extremely important, because you're right, the market puts a premium on SDG investments. But how do I, as an investor or somebody who is basically putting my money towards that certain financial instrument or investment, how do I know that it goes there? So it's not enough to measure and monitor, but it has to be transparently available. And just one more point on this, which I think is also very important, especially for developing countries. Many talk about global standards, that we need these magic bullet that, these are the standards that we need to all meet when a company invests in a greenfield investments, for example. But the problem is, and this is where we need to be careful, because we might, with that, exclude a large part of the world for those investments. And that's, again, going to your questions, what can we do? Many developing countries, the private sector is simply not capacitated to meet those standards. And if we force them to adhere with these standards, we basically exclude them. So we need to couple the idea of the standards with the capacity building and holding hands of private sector, not with the purpose of making them more profitable, but with the purpose of preparing them to engage in a standard-based system that allows us to combine their success in the market, but at the same time to have some impact. So, these are just some very concrete examples of what we do. But I think, what's also very important is how do we couple it with what consumers want and what the market appreciates. And this is where we have seen the change. 20 years ago, before my UN career, I used to be a management consultant. And my job was, like every management consultant, is to make more money for the clients that you're consulting, right? How they can be more effective. And 20 years ago, nobody talked about sustainability. I consulted for many large corporations, and none of the terms of reference included these criteria. And nowadays, I don't think there's any private sector entity that does not consider it, even if they don't do it. So I think, that's a huge change. So how we can put pressure, not just from an incentive perspective, from the policies, regulatory frameworks, and the profit orientation, but from the consumers, and for those who are looking for these actions from the private sector. And just a very last thing, sorry, I'm probably talking more than I'm supposed to, but I think it's also very important that we look at how private sector operates internally. So we have something called the Business and Human Rights Initiative. And essentially what it's about, it says human rights, but what it's about is how can we have responsible practices within the private sector so that they're not just generating goods, but actually they walk the talk. They have decent jobs, they incorporate the gender norms and so forth. Because at the end of the day, when we look at the impact of a private sector investment or a private sector production, it has to be a net impact that's positive. You could have a company that's producing fantastic solar panels or, biomass or whatever. But let's say, they exclude the local market because they bring in their workforce from the country of origin, or they don't necessarily respect the decent job conditions. So at the end of the day, how do you ensure that the net output is not just about the solar panels they produce, but actually contribution to decent jobs and everything else? So that's where we need to come in and look at in a very integrated way and work with the private sector and the business sector across the board so that, you know, this understanding is there. And they know business. We, I would say, know the SDGs more or less. So this is where we come together. We can provide an advice that allows them to achieve more and in a more sustainable way.
Thank you very much for, oh, sorry. I'll go along then. Thank you very much for the answer. And I think it's very important talking about these SDGs in standard system. I hope there's just not another one which is different from CSDR, because then companies, it's going to be just a headache for them. But my question now goes to António Gambardella, because you said before, I mean, SDGs companies have a competitive advantage, and you said that today investors prefer to invest into SDGs companies, and well, I'm not very sure about that, at least in Europe. But my question is not about that, but specifically, in May 2023, the EU Commission published the Raw Materials Act to ensure that we don't run out of resources or metals that we need to make those high-tech technologies, which are key in order to go towards this sustainability path. And from 2011 to 2021, Fongit has gone from 33% of clean tech startups to now 10% in your portfolio. Today, ICT startups represent 24% of Fongit's portfolio. The question is simple. In order to ensure a more sustainable future, shouldn't Fongit be supporting more clean tech startups rather than deep tech startups? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, Fongit is supporting a bit less of clean tech startup, but let me disagree with the concept of clean tech startup here. I mean, clean tech is just probably 1-2 SDGs, pure clean tech, you know, when we end up talking about climate action, affordable clean energy. I would argue that any type of digital company providing solutions that are really material, they normally tend to go towards optimization, therefore towards energy efficiency. It is a general statement. I will try to make a bit the argument. But your point is good because actually it has two implications. First of all, to see SDGs only climate-driven, I think, I mean, you guys are the expert. I think it is very narrow. And second, the fact that we need to understand that normally deep tech startups, they are added value, and they tend to optimize the processes rather than creating complexity. And this normally, as a result, as an energy efficient as well. So it's an indirect action. I will go a bit further. So now today in the portfolio of Fongit, among the under 70 companies, I would say that roughly more than 70%, just to stay safe, are addressing at least one SDGs clearly, directly, with a net positive impact. For me, it's clear the net positive impact. Again, something that 2 years ago we're not even mentioning, the net element. We can talk about the industry, car industry, batteries, if you want. And then the second is the funding mechanism that we have at Fongit. You need to be 100% SDG compliant. If not, you don't get the money. So it's, in fact, it's de facto the first impact fund state-supported that we have in Geneva, okay? But I want to give you a clear example that maybe talks more than just my theory. You know what is one of the companies that, in my opinion, is addressing more the SDG goals? It's very counterintuitive that we have at Fongit. Is a company called, named Proton. Proton is a company doing encrypted email, encrypted messaging, encrypted drive, encrypted everything. And it was born at Fongit. It was born at CERN, they moved at Fongit. And that company, is it a clean tech company? Of course it's not. Of course it's not. Is it a deep tech company? Yes, it is. Very, very deep, because these guys are scientists from CERN. And yet, in their mission they are addressing the quality education, they're addressing the inequality issue, they're addressing the peace and justice. This is a company that already contributes with a significant percentage, not of the profit, but of the revenues, to all actions related to freedom of speech, protection of journalists that are threatened today in difficult locations, going from Geneva, helping countries that are very difficult. So for me, that is the example of what an SDG company should look like out of Switzerland, because your clean tech argument is very true. But I'm not expecting, to be honest, to find companies doing, apart from the exception I gave you, the TVP Solar, we have a few others, doing clean tech applications out of Switzerland. Because Switzerland is a country that is deep tech by nature. Switzerland is a country that has startups related to coming from universities, addressing very niche problem, very specific, very deep problem, normally generating IP, and very often addressing B2B markets. So I'm not expecting to find production facilities of solar panels in Switzerland ever. I'm addressing to find deep tech companies, added value that will optimize whatever process they're trying to optimize, and as a natural consequence will be also clean tech efficient. This is my assumption, but I'm happy to be challenged, because what is interesting is that also regarding your previous, you say you don't believe about the investors. Yeah, maybe it was a bit bold statement from my side, but I prefer to be optimistic than, I'm expecting young people to be more optimistic than we are. But your point is true, but it's a trend, it's inevitable. All investors, because of their investors behind, they will be forced to look for SDG companies because they're asking to do that. Next week, there will be in Geneva an event called Building Bridges, you know, where Geneva will become, for 1 week or so, the capital of sustainable finance. And what these guys are talking about, how to do investment, SDG, how to be less greenwashing and so on. It's a trend, it's inevitable, it will come. SDG is doomed to succeed in a way or another from Geneva point of view. Then what you were mentioning, guys, I mean, this is a different story, and this is my opinion. Inequality is the issue, and the different distribution of information and knowledge is another issue that I want to enter into. But from Geneva, I'm sure of it, because I'm seeing it from the entrepreneurs.
Can I rebound quite quickly? Just to comment on specific things, because I work in sustainable IT. So I've worked in actually working with DG and DG Connect and actually establishing the frameworks of what sustainability is for ICT and deep tech. And just to comment, because energy efficient doesn't mean more sustainable. Actually, when you talk about carbon footprint, usually for any IT application, SaaS service, PaaS service, energy accounts for 30% of the CO2 emissions. That's for CO2. If we look at other indicators, then those values can change. And if you talk about resources like raw metals, might be around 10-15%. So that was just one comment. And secondly, about investors, I didn't say that I don't believe in investors. I just say that investors look at taxonomy lines, SFDR lines, and not about SDG lines. Because for me, there's not quantified enough work with those PE firms, with those venture capital firms. And that's the way Europe is going. I mean, you need like quantitative values and you need real data to be able to say, so they've gone from 50 kilograms of CO2 to 30. And that's, for now, my experience with the companies, with private sector, the SDGs don't provide that. And SFDR and taxonomy does.
All right. Things are starting to get heated now. Yeah. But before we transition to the audience, I just suggest that we finish with one last question. Ines, if you would like to end things for us before we open it up for Q&A.
Thank you. So yeah, the concept of degrowth is gaining attention as a means to address environmental challenges while promoting social equity. And I've been facing this concept quite a few times now during my studies. And the last question goes back again to His Excellency, Ambassador Wilson. In your diplomatic capacity, how do you envision international cooperation in advancing policies that encourage degrowth or alternative economic models. Can you share insights from Barbados, or especially other richer nations, where steps have been taken to transition from growth-centric economies to ones emphasizing sustainability and well-being?
Thanks. How many people in here know what degrowth means? Show of hands. Okay, well, I did not know what degrowth meant until you asked me that question, honestly. I had to ask my colleague in my office, can you please, he's an economist, I'm not an economist. I said, listen, this is a deep econometric question, please research this for me. We don't know that concept in small developing countries or LDCs. I can't go and tell my producers in Barbados, you need to slow down. You need to slow down. Produce less, consume less. It's not going to happen. I just don't know if it's fair to ask countries and populations that have not contributed to the state of the world where we are today to pause their growth and development trajectory. However, is degrowth necessary to support the global commons? Likely, yeah. We all have to play our part. But when you buy the latest iPhone or the newest fast fashion or coffee with beans that are grown in another country, is that spitting in the face of degrowth at an individual level? Are we also asking individuals and countries and companies and governments to do what is simply not contrary to their nature? If you look at big tech after COVID, the profits that they have are just absolutely astounding, But again, we have to do what we have to do to protect the global commons. But for me, this whole notion of common but differentiated responsibility means that even if all states are responsible for addressing global environmental issues, for example, not all are equally responsible. So you have to look at this notion of common but differentiated. Now, be that as it may, Barbados is making some steps, and I guess some of the things that we're doing would align with this new concept for me of degrowth. So we do aim to be carbon neutral by 2030, and we're doing quite a lot in terms of sustainable industrial development to promote cleaner and more resource-efficient ways of doing things. But I have to tell you that we have never once used that concept of degrowth, because if we were, I think the next day we'll have a new government and a new ambassador. But I just want to give you very, very briefly, because I know time is running out, some idea of what we as a small country are doing to contribute to this notion of degrowth. And I'm going to have to read because I don't want to get them wrong. So the first thing we've done is a ban on single-use plastics, which, I have to tell you, for small developing countries, for LDCs, for African countries, I don't know about you guys, but if you ever come into a Caribbean kitchen and you open a cupboard, there is one cupboard dedicated to plastic bags. Seriously, you'll find nothing in there but plastic bags. We've been told growing up that plastic is a good thing, that plastic is convenience. And then all of a sudden, we turn around and tell, well, no, plastic is not a good thing. You have to get rid of single-use plastic. So it's also taken, I think, you almost have to take a psychological approach to kind of changing the population's view on single-use plastics. But we've done it, and we've placed a ban on the import, distribution, sale, and use of single-use plastic containers. And like I said, we're looking at alternatives, like using seaweed, which is a surprisingly excellent way to develop plastic substitutes. And actually at the WTO, we're actually, I spend most of my time at the WTO. Barbados, Fiji, China, Ecuador, and Morocco are actually leading the negotiations for trade and plastic pollutions at the WTO. So this is something we're taking seriously. One of the second things we did is in the area of health, where we imposed a tax on sweetened beverages, on soft drinks, 20%, because, you have to use taxes and tariffs, I think, sometimes to push your community, your population along in terms of taking some of these decisions, which will will support this notion of degrowth, because you know, degrowth can also be knocked off its rails by a population which is unhealthy in the long term. Then, in terms of equity, we revised the minimum wage. In the middle of COVID, we revised the minimum wage, which also shows, you know, support for, you know, social redistribution as well. In agriculture, we are looking to do a lot more in terms of promoting this whole notion of farm to fork, just trying to bring the tourism industry and the agriculture industry a little bit closer together, rather than importing all of these foreign goods. Use what you have. Be innovative about using the ingredients that you grow as well. We're looking at certain kinds of farming, which we've never done before, you know, vertical farming, working with countries like China, for example, to look at different yields of rice, for example, where you need to use less water. Then I had mentioned earlier about kind of transforming all of the our transportation, our public transportation, into using electric buses as well. So I think we've done quite a lot there in terms of reducing reliance on fossil fuel. And then you have a tax holiday on the importation of electric cars and hybrids, to encourage people to buy those rather than continue with the gas guzzlers. So, I mean, do I think Barbados needs to degrow in this kind of very traditional sense of looking at it, like slowing down? Not really. But I think there's, you know, real value in exploring certain kinds of policies and also social change in ways that can bring a little bit more inclusivity and sustainability to the way that we produce, consume, and live. So, but thanks for teaching me a new concept. Thank you.
So the youth can teach too. I know we still have some questions that have been prepared, but I propose that we open things up to the audience, and then we can always loop back to those if time permits. So just a few ground rules. Please introduce yourself when you take the mic. Try to keep to questions as opposed to comments. And that's it. So questions in the audience, which I don't know who it's supposed to be.
Thank you. So my name is Denise Decius. I'm from Canada, but I'm a dual master's student here at the University of Geneva, doing the Masters of Innovation, Human Development, and Sustainability, and also at the University of Beijing. But my question is for Ambassador Wilson. Just wanted to see what are your expectations for the outcomes of the SIDS 4 conference coming up with Antigua and Barbuda, and also how the diaspora, especially for youth, can participate and prepare for that conference as well. Thank you.
Maybe ideally we'll group together 2 or 3 questions if there are other questions in the audience. Do we have any takers? No? Okay, well then you can respond directly, Ambassador, and then maybe we'll go back.
Yeah, thanks a lot for bringing that notion of the SIDS conference into the discussion. So for those of you who don't know, every 10 years, the UN community gets together in a beautiful small island developing state and discusses what we can do to bring SIDS more into the global economy, how we can help them to develop more and develop better. So this is happening next year in March, I think, in Antigua and Barbuda. Never before, I think, has there been a more apt time to discuss the problems of SIDS. You know, when I say we're on the front lines of the climate crisis, I mean that legitimately. You know, every time I see something that happened in Libya or Morocco, or I get terrified. I absolutely get terrified. It's an awful way to live, because if any of those tragedies were to happen in my small country, which is only 270,000 people, we're wiped out. We are absolutely wiped out. I can't remember which small island development state I was listening to recently, and they were saying that they had done a projection, scientists had done a projection of what their country would look like in the next 30 and 50 years if things continued as they are today. And they would lose 70% of their land mass. So you're creating a whole generation of climate refugees, for example. So, I mean, this meeting next year is really supposed to look at operational ways of helping to bring SIDS more into the global debate. But importantly, and this is the most important thing, people don't like to talk about money, huh? But you have to talk about money if you're going to talk about policies and implementation. You know, so I absolutely abhor, and I'm a former UN person, so this is not a critique of the UN, but I hate all of these strategies and policies that don't have price tags attached to them, because those policies and strategies go into people's top drawer or bottom drawer. They need to be priced, and when they need to be priced, then you need to start looking at partners to be able to implement them. So my hope, based on how things are going, is that this conference next year will be operational. We'll look at real costed pathways to deliver on some of what they have to deliver, and more importantly, we'll really put climate change issues at the forefront in a way that they have not been for a very long time. In terms of the diaspora, I would say one of the biggest things about the diaspora is not reparations, that's a whole other debate. What's that called? Remittances. Although we can talk about reparations, but maybe another day. But no, remittances, I think if you look at the amount of remittances vis-a-vis a country, small island development states GDP per year, you see how incredibly important the diaspora is. What I would love is for the diaspora to invest a little bit more in the private sector and in the small island development states. I think that would really do quite a lot to increase the pie in some of our small countries. Thanks.
Thank you. Do we have other questions in the audience? Here and then here.
Hello, my name is Joan Fulton. I'm with the Ocean Assets Institute. Tying together sustainability and money, blue economy essentially, and business and value. One of the problems, and this is a question for all you business students out there and all you developmental people as well, it's a general question, because what we value has no value. And this is one of the fundamental problems. So the question is, how can we change the economic financial form or formula, which essentially gives no value to anything beyond 10 years, if you do your NPV calculations. So how do you value what we value? So that's one question. And the second one is, do not forget ocean states. You know, if we talk about small islands and yet you talk about their economic value, you're really talking about the ocean state. So that these smaller SIDS in particular can be huge nations. So who can come up with an idea how we can change the financial formula so we actually unlock that 1%? Because the financial markets are stuck. They're not allowed to. Their investors want numbers. So somebody's got to come up with a value. So I leave that with you, young people in particular.
All right, thank you, and we'll group that with the question of the gentleman over there.
Hi, thank you. My name's Andrew Glass. I'm with an organisation called Viridius. And it kind of links into exactly what you were saying there in valuation around the SDGs in particular. But the role of voluntary carbon markets and how they may be able to deliver change on the ground to the communities, such as in Barbados, where we can unlock SDGs embedded in these voluntary carbon projects. I'm just wondering if the panel has any comments around what they think about voluntary carbon markets and how they could integrate with both the SDG development and also valuation.
I was told to speak on the first point. I'm maybe not old, I'm not so young, but I guess I still qualify to be youngish. Listen, I think the point you're making on the value is a very critical one, because the truth is that today's economy does not function around, or does not measure what's supposed to be measuring. Does that make sense to you? I mean, if you think about it, again, I spoke about the costing before. I mean, we do not assign costs to what actually really matters for the future. And I mean, we speak a lot about at the lab on the term of long-term sustainability and the need to think about it from an intergenerational impact assessment point of view. And the reason why we do that, it's because it's through the leveraging and also the preservation of assets today that we actually will retain, not retain, in fact, that we will achieve whatever it's called, sustainability. And I think it also goes with the question, what is it that we want to sustain? I mean, if I may say. The point on value again, I think interesting enough, and I have a conflictive relationship with my UN identity. But lately, I've been quite proud, because I think as a UN Secretariat, we here at the UN Geneva, you know, and of course together with the agencies as a system, we're looking into ways of thinking beyond GDP, if that makes sense. And I think the truth is we are living in times for the past 50 years, even longer, that has been very much dominated by a very, and I'm very open for those people who know me, very neoliberal paradigm that has put maybe value into things that we are not supposed to be valuing that much. Does that make sense? So the question is really, how can we change that? And then in a second step, how can we actually really redesign economic systems? And that also goes into financial systems that are aligned with those values that are human, and they're aligned with those values that are also within the planetary boundaries. And I think that's the work, one of the key works, transformative works, I would say, efforts that lay ahead now in the 7 years to go, but also beyond, because that's the challenge, at least one of the key challenges. I don't know if it resonates with you, but yeah.
Just to add to it a little bit, because you're very right. I mean, we're not necessarily putting a value on or evaluate that from a perspective of a direct link, but there are many ways how we are already doing it, how we can do more. So one example, just to pick up on what Özge said, is about the measure of growth. You know, we're living in a GDP measurement. The growth is based on GDP world. And actually, the SDGs are pushing the world to a GDP plus measurement, which says, you know, look at also the sustainability of it. So UNDP produces, for example, something called the Human Development Index. So, you know, to put these sustainability measurements together with the GDP, and then, you know, you have a different system. And a second example on this, how to do that is, of course, you know, business will follow what makes business sense. So it's a matter of incentives, financial incentives. So you can do that valuation of these things is to follow the subsidies from an economic perspective. Now we are subsidizing fossil fuels. So of course it doesn't make business sense to invest otherwise. But if you change those subsidies and you start putting the business value towards the things that we want to see as a value, then essentially you're putting business sense around that value system.
Is there someone else on this side of the panel, or perhaps on the other side, that would like to pick up a point in relation to those two questions?
Yeah, I can maybe, just very quickly, because I want to just make your comment about GDP. So the question about degrowth, in fact, is the wrong question, unfortunately, because we are asking something related to a metric that has been used for the last 3 centuries. It doesn't apply anymore. That's a problem. And on top, you want to ask the people who are measured financial markets on GDP indirectly to re-question that metric. Impossible. So the only way I see it, and I see it from a technological innovation standpoint, is that we are leading towards an economy, at least in developed countries, in the lucky place where we are in Switzerland, towards a zero marginal cost economy, in a way or another. We are going towards a moment, sooner or later, maybe I'm not going to see in my life, but maybe yes, where we don't have to work because we have to work. So universal income will be the way to do it. So we're highly productive. That is the way to go. By the way, also at the State of Geneva, in the group that we are having, we already discussed about those things, projecting the future of Geneva in 30 years from now. So the real issue is not GDP degrowth. The real issue is equal distribution of wealth. That is the real issue that we're going to face for the next 30 years or so. And that is, in my opinion, the question to answer. How we distribute equally the wealth that rich countries today have the luxury to have.
Sorry, I just want to pick up. It's just my luck to learn a new concept to be told is obsolete in the same day. Oceans, completely agree with you. Actually, we've been trying to change a lot of the language that we use from saying we're a small island developing state to a large ocean economy. But for me, that's just semantics, because I mean, what's the sense in having a large ocean economy and then you don't have ownership of it? You're not able to exploit it. You know, you have large shipping vessels from larger countries coming in, taking your trawling your fish, or you just don't have the ability to exploit it. So I'm not really sure what that means in real terms. And then on carbon pricing, I don't know enough about it, but I will say that in Barbados, we are looking at it very favorably as a way to create a new income source as well. But then you look at what the EU is doing, let's say on CBAM, you know, and I will say CBAM has a lot of developing countries and a lot of small businesses in developing countries, especially in Africa, very, 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 very worried. And it comes back to an issue that I think you said earlier about a lot of these small companies don't have the ability to even recognize what the regulations are, far less meet them, you know? So, you know, a lot of these carbon border adjustment measures, they sound great, and they do serve a purpose, including increasing profitability of certain companies in Europe. But if you're not careful, you're gonna create a whole class of unemployment and hence more irregular migration in a lot of these developing countries if you don't also look at the implication of these policies on them. Thanks.
Thank you. So I believe back here we had one or two hands. Yes, so here.
Hi, so my name is Shan Madaji. I work for a company called Impact that is actually supported by Fongit, so I work in the Fongit offices. Hi, Antonio. So yeah, I have a question directed to you, Ms. Beres. Obviously, everyone can answer, but obviously I'm really passionate about impact measurement, and I absolutely agree with you. I think that to close the gap between the reality and the perception of the reality, especially in emerging markets, we need to measure impact. So my question to you first is, how do we measure impact? Like, what would be the ideal approach to you? And second, how can we drive incentives for financial institutions to actually measure the impact and make that effort? Because it's not something that most financial institutions are doing right now because maybe they lack incentives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have one more question back here? Maybe while we wait, I'll allow Harry to insert one of your questions, throw them in the mix.
Mine can actually, it can be concluding remarks because my question will be for Mrs. Veres. So, yeah.
Sorry for my English. I try to speak in English. It's difficult for me. But I have heard of the blue economy, and it was very interesting. And I'm asking if the question of sustainability is in reality a big mistake. And I wonder if this question prevents us from changing the paradigm, the real paradigm. If it's maybe a stupid question, I don't know. If it's the economy of predation and accumulation is compatible with the idea of respect of nature and creation. It's maybe a spiritual question, spiritual interrogation. But I think that to continue to think that sustainability is the solution, for me, it is a problem. Thank you.
Very good one. Thank you very much. Who would like to jump in first? Maybe, yeah, Rosendo?
I can maybe answer to that from a technical point of view in terms for the question on sustainability. So I don't think it's a wrong term. Maybe people just might not understand it correctly. With this, what do I mean? When something is sustainable, I mean, it can be sustained over time, no? And so if that's the principle, if you're inbound, inflows and outflows, match over time, then there shouldn't be a problem. Because in terms of, when you talk about CO2, for example, now we're emitting about 40 gigatons of CO2 more than we should. But if the equation is right, if what you put in, in and out is the same, if you stabilize the system, if you make it sustainable, then it should work. So for me, that's why I don't think it's a wrong term.
Can I speak to this? Because I think you asked the question. I mean, all of you ask very interesting questions, but I think you hit it on a very philosophical point, if I may say, that is, I said just before, what is it that we want to sustain? And we don't have the slide up right now, but one of the things we are oftentimes discussing is, we are in times of shifting paradigms. I'm sure you all can feel it. And I think it's interesting because we spoke about this again this morning in a meeting. We had the MDGs, for those who know. We have the SDGs right now, but what's next? What are the SDGs plus plus? And I think that should be about the paradigm shift. And if I may say, we haven't really spoken about it today. We spoke about GDP, for instance, But really, I think the only way to sustain our lives, because it's about the question of life, is to think in regenerative terms. We have to really think about it in redesigning the way how we do things. I mean, again, it's not about scratching out everything that we know in terms of what exists, but I think it's understanding what are the elements of the current systems that we want to sustain for the time to come. And you need to find ways to recircle. I mean, circularity, of course, economy, you all know that. But really, we need to find a way that those concepts that are today at the margin, such as regeneration, for example, they really become the new norm, because we do not have the resource otherwise. I mean, c'est comme ça. I mean, I think, you know, at some point we will hit the road and at the end, and we are already doing that, but we keep on with the same car that is not fit for purpose. I think that's a question we really need to maybe take today when we walk out of this room, I would even say. Thank you. So thank you for this. Merci.
So thank you for the question on the impact measurement. I mean, how we measure it. I mean, essentially put it simply, it's a set of indicators. But it's a set of complex and integrated indicators, and that's what makes it so difficult. Because when we were just talking about green investments, it is still very complicated, but it's looking at emissions and other things. But when you're looking at SDG bonds or SDG measurement, it's really a complex set of bringing together gender indicators with climate, with poverty, and many other things. Now, in terms of then the second part of the question, it's the most important is what do you do with this measurement? How do you link it to action? How do you link it to incentives? So, one way is what we're trying to do now is tweaking the existing system. So there's a stock exchange, how you can have the stock exchange take these measurements. Can you use certification of companies that suddenly would be perceived by the consumers and the investors as a better way to go, and so forth. But I think, and I will leave that kind of as an answer to all the questions, I think the issue is these tweakings are not enough, and they are not, impactful enough. So how can we really do a transformation that's bringing us completely different things? So in a way, in certain ways, you have to do tabula rasa and just redesign things, because when you're adjusting, you're always bringing by products with you that are not, generating that result. So that's where innovation comes in. And I don't mean technological innovation or digitalization, but overall of how we're thinking about these problems. Like, can we tie these measurements to advertisement costs? There's no link at the moment, or anything else. We really need to think out of the box, or, TikTok hits or whatever. So there has to be some way of connecting the incentives with these measurements, and I think that's the link that we need to strengthen.
Are there any other responses from the panelists with respect to those questions? No? All right, so we're slowly coming to the end of our time here. I would just open things up to everyone if they have some final words, and perhaps as we kind of walk out of this room and we connect back to the theme, which was keeping up commitments. So what you might, in a short word or two, consider to be the most essential in keeping up those commitments. There were a lot of things that were brought to the fore tonight. Partnerships, thinking about motivations, what are hidden incentives, how do we incentivize, while nonetheless offering some hope as well, the way that sustainability has nonetheless become a term that is, and a concept that is considered in current practices today. So I'll pass it over to here as we slowly.
Yes. Thank you. My question is for Mrs. Veres. Now, one of the fundamental principles of the 2030 Agenda is leaving no one behind, starting with the most vulnerable first. And as we find ourselves midway through the 2030 Agenda, what are some of the paramount lessons gained throughout the past 8 years that can guide us effectively towards the next 7 years and to best achieve the ambitions of the 2030 Agenda? And what can UNDP do specifically to guide the way for bolder sustainable development policies? Thank you.
Ooh, that's a big question for the last 30 seconds. So I'll try to be kind of short, make a long answer short. So, in terms of leaving no one behind, that's the core of the SDG agenda, right? Because we can achieve a lot, going back to the GDP discussion, but if it's unequal, if we really have vulnerable groups, urban-rural divide, small island development states versus big economies and so forth, then overall we really have a problem. So what we found now at this point, midpoint in the SDGs, is that 15% of the SDGs are on track. So that means we have a lot of way to go. And part of the problem is the inequalities and the leaving behind certain groups' agenda. So a few things we need to focus on to close this gap. Strengthening the institutions, domestic, local, global governance mechanisms, because without that, we can't really enforce these policies. That was one of the first questions. How do you enforce? What do you do with it? So we need to have strengthened systems, and systems that are talking to each other. The second one is really looking at innovation as a fuel behind it, and that's a bit tied to digitalization. The third one is really about resilience. Goes back to your adaptation versus mitigation points. How do we build resilience that will allow us to do that? Resilience to shocks, to crisis, to COVID, and all the other things that we have been seeing. And then where is the biggest control sits in this? And I would argue that cities have a huge role to play. About 75% of the world is in cities. So where do we put these mechanisms that could affect the biggest way of bringing those behind up to track as well? But that's a very simplified answer, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, if there are any last dying words from the rest of the panelists? I mean, I guess my take-home message would be we need fewer drones, fewer pens, and deeper engagement. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you for coming this way. Thank you to the audience.